In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains what it means when your belief system is working.
The point is that your interpretation of the world carries within it implicitly a theory about its own validity. And the theory about its own validity is that if you enact it in the world, it will produce the result that you desire. And then the consequence of that is that if it doesn't produce the result that you desire, then it isn't a good enough theory, period. And that's how you grapple with the fact that although you don't know everything, you still have to orient yourself in the world. You lay out partial theories that make partial predictions, and if they do a good enough job, then you don't worry about it anymore and you go on to the next thing. Okay, so then you think there's a lot of constraints piling up on your interpretations. Number one, they have to work for the creature that you are. And so, you know, we can lay sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, something like that. It's not exactly the same, because I don't think that he got the hierarchy right for very complex reasons. But it's reasonably obvious to observe that, well, you're not going to work out very well if you don't have anything to eat. And you know, you've got about a week in you if you don't have anything to drink. And obviously you need shelter, and you know, you need companionship. And by need, what I mean is that if you don't have these things, then you die. The whole game comes to a halt. So we can ground that in self-evident reality without any real problem. And you might say, well, what's the list of human necessities? And that's a difficult thing to parameterize, because you can argue about the degree to which something is necessary, but there's some things that we know about. Well, we covered the basics: temperature regulation, elimination, food intake, shelter, right? But then there's more subtle things like, well, children, for example, die without touch. So there's something integral about tactile interaction with other people. So we could call that love if you wanted to. It's not optional, right? Play is the same thing. Children do not develop properly unless they play. And I would say that adults also can't maintain their mental health or physical health unless they play too. And so you could say, well, there's a core set of necessities, and then off of that there's a secondary set of, like, what would you call them? They're not ultimate necessities, but they're going to be pretty highly valued by people and more or less universally. Pain avoidance, for example, under most circumstances. Most people don't really like to be in terror. Most people really don't like to be disgusted. You know, you can lay out the basic emotions, you can lay out the basic motivations, and you can say, well, the game that you're going to play has to operate within a space that's defined by that set of a priori constraints. Fine. Now, things are getting pretty constrained here. So the game you play has to satisfy that set of biological demands, intrinsic biological demands, and it has to be something that you can utilize with other people voluntarily, and it has to be something that will be playable across multiple iterations. And I would say there's a very limited number of interpretive structures that are going to satisfy all of those preconditions simultaneously. And to me, that just blows out the two things. It blows out the claims of moral relativism, and it also demolishes, and this is the same thing in some sense, it demolishes ideas that the manner in which people organize themselves in the world as individuals and as societies is somehow arbitrary. It doesn't look to me to be arbitrary at all. And so, and Piaget's genius, I think in some part, was observing that in children spontaneously, in that when children pass the egocentric phase, which means after they're about 2 years of old, they're approaching 3 years old. They've more or less got their internal mechanisms organized so that they're a unitary being, roughly speaking. At 3, they start to develop the ability to use fictional frames of reference. So, and that's an interesting thing, because I would say that the fundamental biological systems come armed with their own frame of reference. So if you're hungry, poof, up comes a frame of reference. And within that, your perceptions are shaped, the action proclivities are primed, and the world lays itself out around that particular biological necessity. And you can lay those out. Same if you're thirsty, same if you're too hot, same if you want to play. All those systems come built in. But then the problem with that is that they compete, because it isn't obvious which one should take priority, and then it's not that easy to organize them in a social space. And so what seems to have happened to human beings is that we've been able to replace the frame that's predicated on motivational necessity with abstracted frames that are more voluntarily constructed, that incorporate multiple motivational systems simultaneously. And that's, in some sense, that's also what, it's the same thing as we've learned how to think abstractly. And so the frame that you're going to lay out on the world, if it's a good frame, is one that solves a whole set of problems at the same time. And so that, and you can slot different frames, you can experiment with different frames, and that's a precondition to being able to play, because one of the things that Piaget pointed out, you can see this when children pretend play, it's like, and even more clearly in games that have rules, but let's say they're in pretend play, and they're going to say, well, we're going to lay out a little fictional schema here, we're going to play house, and you can be the cat, and I'll be the dad, and then you negotiate a bit to see if those roles are acceptable, and then you run it as a simulation, and that's what kids are doing when they're playing. And they're experimenting with different superordinate frames of reference that are actable in the world, and they're learning how to develop those perceptual schemes, and also how to interact in a manner that allows the scheme that they're using to find its social acceptability. And it's successful. The child assumes that the scheme is successful if both children have fun while they're doing it. And so that's the voluntarism. And so Piaget made a very interesting point about that I think is absolutely brilliant. He said that there's a difference between a game that people will play voluntarily and one that has to be enforced. And so then you can imagine an environment where game A is played voluntarily, it has a certain end, and game B is played by force, but both of them are moving towards the same end. And Piaget's claim was the game that's played voluntarily, or even more to the point, the set of all games that are played voluntarily will outcompete the set of all games that are played by force if they're put head to head in a competitive environment. I thought, God, that's such a brilliant observation, because there you have the basis for a pragmatic grounding for the evaluation of ethics. It's like, you can pick the target, it doesn't matter, whatever target you pick. If the game is voluntary and aimed at the target, it will defeat a game that's imposed by tyranny. Now, it's a proposition, but it's a pretty good proposition, and I would say there's a fair bit of evidence for this proposition, and a fair bit of it is actually derived from observation of animal behavior, because I ran you guys through the emerging literature on the stability, say, of chimpanzee hierarchies, and the chimpanzee tyrant hierarchy isn't very stable, and the reason for that is that two subordinate chimps who are 3/4 as strong as the dominant tyrant can take him out, and they do. And so then the question might be, well, how do you have to conduct yourself as a high dominance chimp if you're not going to be torn apart by those who are hypothetically your subordinates? And the answer to that is, well, don't be too much of a tyrant. Formulate some social connections. Engage in some reciprocity with regards to your social relationships. Don't oppress the females. Don't torment the children, etc., because that makes you unpopular, and then you'll get torn to shreds. And so there are practical limits on the expression of tyranny that are a consequence both of biological limitations, because people are going to object if the system is set up so that their fundamental needs aren't met, and they're also going to object if the game that's being played isn't functioning socially. And so this is a very, very tight set of constraints. And then the question might be, okay, if you take that set of constraints, what sort of systems can operate? What would you say? Well, just that. What set of systems can operate within those sets of constraints? Then you might say, if you take the set of all systems that might operate within those constraints, and you look at what's common across them, then you could extract out what's essentially a universal morality. It's something like that.
Thanks for watching.